So we moved back to Alabama, and I began to work at CEI Publishing Company. Just so you don't think any big ideas about all this, let me tell you a couple of facts. I got a job preaching on Sunday at a church out in the country. It was so conservative, the men sat on one side and the women sat on the other. They were so traditional, but after Sunday school, before church, most of the men would go out in the yard and have a cigarette, take one big glass draw on the step outside, pitch their flipper cigarette in the yard and walk in the house blowing smoke. And they thought they were the only ones going to heaven. Well, I started preaching at that church, and they paid me the grand sum of $80 a week, which wasn't too bad in those days, 1972. I made $80 a week at the publishing company, so I had a combined total of $160 a week. We built a new house. We just had a baby. We didn't have a parsonage anymore like we did in St. Louis, and my wife wasn't working like she had been before. So it's a change in circumstances. When we moved there, I should also say that there was another journal that was part of this squabble going on. And this other one was a very hard-line, what I call legalistic sectarian kind of journal. And they particularly had decided that I was a bad character, primarily because I was teaching the grace of God. And I was telling people they were saved because of what Jesus did for us, not because we get everything right for ourselves. And they thought that was heresy. They also didn't like it because I was saying we could have fellowship with the folks they call the liberals in our church, and not to mention Baptists and some other people outside our group. And so they considered me a proponent of what they came to label as the grace, unity, fellowship, heresy, because those were all bad things in their mind, grace, unity, and fellowship. You don't want any of that stuff. So during the course of about 5 to 10 years, they wrote me up in their paper, featured, telling how bad I was, probably, I think, 39 times. But I was kind of famous in a way you just as soon not be at this time. So we moved back to Alabama under those circumstances, and I started preaching at that church and start working at CEI Publishing Company. Next slide, please. Psalm 71:10 says, "My enemies have spoken against me, and those who watch for my life have consulted together, saying, God has forsaken him. Pursue and seize him, for there is no one to deliver." And I thought that verse fitted in this part of the story quite well. At this time, there were two of the debating crusaders of that particular faction of the Church of Christ who came to Limestone County, Alabama, and held meetings in churches around the county. This is the county that I grew up in, where my dad was highly regarded, where I was known and respected. And the substance of their, quote, gospel meeting was a big bedsheet chart that had a picture on it of a big old-fashioned sailing ship with a lot of little ropes going off to the side with little anchors on all the ropes and a little hatchet chopping all the anchors. And a big headline across the top that said, "The false teaching of Ed Fudge is chopping the anchors that hold the ship of Zion." Well, if that doesn't make you feel good, I don't know what it'd take. They held this meeting in several churches around, and that was going on, while this other magazine was writing me up regularly over a period of time. And then one day I was in Decatur, Alabama, 10 miles down the road, at the printing shop where we did our printing business. And I get a phone call from my mother's secretary, and she says, "Your mother wanted me to call and tell you that X and Y are here in the store right now, and you don't have to come back to the store today if you don't want to." Well, X and Y were the publisher of the other paper that had been writing me up and the editor of the other paper that had been writing me up. And they were there because Mother had sold the business a few years earlier to a group of men who she trusted, but unknown to her or to any of us, they had sold it to X and Y on the sly, and they were there that day to take over. So I said, well, I'm not going to leave Mother there by herself with those guys. I'll come back up there myself. I got back up there. The president of the company, who was the fellow that sold it to them, came in to see me. He says, Brother C wants to, I'm making up some initials here, Brother C wants to talk to you. So he calls me into my mother's office, and I sit down in my mother's office under my father's portrait, and Brother C is talking to me. And he says, I just want you to know that if you'll change your teaching and give up these errors that you've been teaching. Brother B out in California, who's our money bags, he didn't call him that, but that's what he was, is prepared to help take care of you generously for the rest of your life. All I could think about at that moment was Simon the sorcerer, and thy money perish with thee. And so at that point, the president of the company said, well, you're fired. And I said, when? And he said, now. And so I went home to my wife and I said, I've got good news and bad news. Which do you want first? She had just come home from the hospital 10 days earlier with our newborn son. She said, I guess I want the good news first. And I said, well, the good news is I've got 3 weeks' pay in my pocket. The bad news is I don't get any more. So these guys were out to get me, and they just about did. Right about this time, one other little detail I'll pitch in, then we'll move to the next slide. Right about this time, the church that I'd been preaching for, that I mentioned a while ago, elders called me in. They had never invited me to participate in any elders meeting with them ever before. I was totally in the dark always of what was going on, but this day they called me in. I thought, good, I'm going to start talking to the elders. But when I got in there, they said, well, we think it's time for you to go. And I said, why? And they said, well, in the first place, we've never had a preacher more than 2 years, and you've been here 4. In the second place, some of the members, they're not accusing you of saying this, but some of the members have gotten the idea that you think the Baptists and Methodists might also go to heaven. And then they didn't mention this, but just right before that, one of the main men had gotten really upset because I had called on a black brother for prayer who came to a revival and sat on the front in my invitation. And this fellow was very angry about that. And I had confronted him out in front of the building with all the other men standing around and said, I understand you got a problem. He said, yeah, I don't like what you did. And I said, what's the matter with that? He said, well, they got their own church. They ought to go there. And I said, what are you going to do when you get to heaven? And he said, well, all I can say is if they're going to be there, God better have something else for me. And I wasn't smart enough. I should have said, well, he actually does. But instead, I just said, with an attitude like that, I don't think you have to worry about it. Well, I think that probably contributed to the scenario as well. But at any rate, I was fired there as well. So at that point, everything that I had always thought growing up was solid and secure. My daddy had died. The family business had been sold out to the enemy. My reputation was being attacked everywhere I turned. And it just looked like there was nothing left to survive, to tell you the truth. Next slide, please. I cried out to God. Psalm 71:2 says, God, do not be far from me. Oh, my God, hasten to my help. Verse 13, let those who are adversaries of my soul be ashamed. Let them be covered with reproach and dishonor who seek to injure me. And so that was all we had left to do was cry out to God, and that's what we did. And there were times for the next year when I was unemployed that I would take the bills that we had in one hand and the money that I was earning by some freelance work in the other hand and hold them up to God. Say, Lord, this is the money and this is the bills, and the bills are bigger than the money. You got to do something. And we'd go to the mailbox and there'd be a letter from somebody we hadn't heard from in several years. And they'd say, we're just thinking about you and don't know your circumstances, but felt like maybe you could use this, and it would be just what we needed. And that sort of thing happened over and over again. And in other ways, God provided wondrously and miraculously. And the Lord did hear our cry for help. Next slide, please. That's what it says in Psalm 71:14. As for me, I will hope continually and praise you more and more. My mouth shall tell of your righteousness and your salvation all day long, for I do not know the sum of them. The money we needed would come in ways we couldn't explain. I started a little publishing business of my own that I call Personalized Publishing Services. And I would take manuscripts of people that couldn't get their stuff published by regular publishers and produce a book for them and just charge them cost plus. And I paid myself $100 a week out of that for the next year. As it happened, about a year later, I went in the print shop where we had been patronizing them for years with our publishing business. And they had a new typesetting machine sitting there, electronic machine instead of a linotype. And I said to the man who owned the place, have you got anybody to operate that? He said, no, not yet. And I said, I think I'd like to learn how. And he said, are you serious? And I said, yes. And he said, I'll pay you $7 an hour. Well, that sounded like King Midas's fortune to me at that point. So I got a job setting type as a typesetter. Would you believe it? The week I started the typesetting job, the Personalized Publishing Services manuscripts quit coming in. And it was like manna. God provided it while we needed it, and when I got a regular job, that stopped. But He was faithful to provide everything we needed. After being fired from that church, a group of our friends and us who had been meeting on Tuesday nights in our home from different churches, different congregations, and they'd grown very close to each other and were just really being built up in the Lord by reading the Bible and praying and fellowshipping together ourselves. We really liked that better than we did when we were going to church. So when I got fired from that church job, we decided to start meeting on Sundays and call ourselves a church. So we did that. We met in a renovated barn, had a horse in the yard, which is kind of exquisite. And it's also kind of messy when the horse comes in the back door during the week and you're not there. It chews up the hymnals and leaves souvenirs everywhere. But anyway, we met in this barn and we called it Elm Street Church. And I was the unofficial, unpaid pastor there for 7 years, from 1976 to 1982.